What's going on, everybody? It's Andrew here for Bowery Mick History. Hope everyone's having a great Wednesday evening. Um, and today, or tonight rather, we're talking about two of my personal favorite things in the world, history and Star Wars. And this is entirely because this morning, uh, the new Book of Boba Fett series premiered on Disney Plus, and I, like a little nerd that I am, uh, watched that immediately after waking up. Um, so I figured, why not make a whole day of Star Wars and talk about the historical influences and themes in Star Wars, because there are a lot of them. And I guess and um So we're going to talk about some of those themes, not and influences and little details. Um, Not going to go into any, you know, all of them because there are a lot. Just you know, a lot of the big ones, the most noticeable ones, the ones that I find the most neat, really. Just kind of scratching the surface, really. So yeah, let's get started. We're going to start with the biggest um, historical theme, historical influence, um, and that is, the conflict at the heart of Star Wars. Um, Let me get the thing up. There we go. There we go. All right. So it has been confirmed in multiple interviews for years. You know, one of the biggest inspirations for Star Wars was the Second World War. Um, George Lucas, uh, was part of the baby boomer generation. His father served during World War II. Um, so the Second World War was a big influence on you know a lot of his projects, and Star Wars is no different. And we look at the entire you know narrative of the entire Star or most of the Star Wars saga, you know, including the prequels. There are a lot of parallels that can be drawn between that story and World War II. Um, so, for instance, the entire prequel trilogy, episodes 1, 2, and 3, follow the rise of Emperor Palpatine to power. Uh, and Lucas had actually said, with those movies, he wanted to examine how does a democracy become a dictatorship. And there's no better example of a democracy becoming a dictatorship than Nazi Germany. Um, and there are a lot of similarities between what is portrayed on screen in the Star Wars prequels and what actually happened in Germany, just before World War II. The rise of the Nazis and Adolf Hitler. In Star Wars, we see the Galactic Republic at the beginning of Episode 1 is this, you know, relatively kind of peaceful, but still kind of unstable and rife with corruption. It's a bit of an issue that leads to, you know, the Chancellor of the Galactic Republic getting ousted about halfway through the movie, being replaced with, you know, a young or youngish senator named Palpatine. And so he's, and we find, through the movies that Palpatine is manipulating and exploiting this instability and this corruption to put himself into the seat of power, much like Adolf Hitler did uh, in the final days of the Weimar Republic. And then, you know, in Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, there's this big crisis that befalls the Galactic Republic, and Palpatine uses that crisis once again, manipulates the current state of things into being granted by this democratic legislative body emergency powers that allow him to form an army, allow him to enact policies that would normally need a legislative body in order to enact. And that's exactly what Adolf Hitler did shortly after being elected to Chancellor of the Weimar Republic in 1933. And then, once all that is set, and now there's a war going, well, then Palpatine finally makes his final move and declares the Galactic Empire, with him as the one ruler for life. And while this isn't a perfect exact copy and paste of the rise of the Third Reich during World War II, it is clearly being influenced by that history right there. And then in the original Star Wars trilogy, we see a group, an alliance of various peoples from all different backgrounds banding together to fight against this oppressive regime that was set up by Emperor Palpatine, which it's very much World War II-esque. So any way you look at it, World War II is written into the DNA of Star Wars, both in the original and in the prequel trilogy. Not so much in the sequel trilogy, but we're not going to really talk about that tonight. Anyway, I also threw up some pictures up here. The piece of fan art of the flag raising that has been around for a long time. I don't know who originally drew that. I wish I did, because I would love to give them credit. But that is, I remember stumbling upon that, when I was like a 10-year-old. And it shows that, this association between Star Wars and the Second World War is one that a lot of people tend to have, because it's very clearly almost an exact copy of the famous flag-raising photo from Iwo Jima at the end of World War II. And then, of course, the way the Empire is portrayed in the Star Wars films, it is very reminiscent of the Third Reich, of Nazi Germany. In fact, if you delve into the expanded fiction, both what is now referred to as Legends and now the official Disney sanctioned canon, and it's not really expanded upon that much in the Star Wars films and in the various shows that much, but the Empire does actually have an issue. They don't particularly like non-human beings from across the galaxy. They see them as lesser beings. So there is, that yet another, influence of actual history embedded into Star Wars. All right, moving on. Another big influence that many people recognize almost immediately is the influence of the samurai. A lot of people probably know this. One of the biggest inspirations for Star Wars were old samurai movies from the 50s and 60s. In fact, George Lucas has openly admitted that the original Star Wars was more or less an adaptation of a film called The Hidden Fortress, which I believe is a Kurosawa movie. But the Jedi are, as I wrote, as it's put there, space samurai, and a lot of Jedi, or the way they are portrayed, is very much reflects that influence and that history. You know, samurai were, they were supposed to serve a, lord in the days of feudal Japan. Um, they were supposed to act as a sort of peacekeepers of sorts, much like Jedi were supposed to do. And even in certain design choices in costuming for Star Wars, there is that samurai influence, and you can see it in the Jedi robes that are worn by many characters in the original trilogy and in the uh, prequel trilogy, and of course, Darth Vader's famous helmet is very reminiscent um, of that, of the classic samurai armor. Um, so the relation between, or there is that connection there. Um, and I was actually a bit of a sort of related note. I was actually watching the Book of Boba Fett this morning, as I mentioned, and they kept using this word to describe Boba Fett, who's now like the crime lord of Tatooine. They keep using this word to describe him. The word is, I'm gonna butcher it, daimyo. Actually, didn't butcher that, but daimyo. Which, when I first heard it, I was like, that sounds like an actual word. And sure enough, daimyo is an actual word in the Japanese language, and it describes a feudal lord, you know, and which more or less is the role that Boba Fett is occupying in that specific instance. Um, but the samurai were, sworn to serve a daimyo, and if the daimyo died, well, that's a whole different story. I'm going off on a tangent. Anyway, so there is that, strong connection between, or strong influence of the samurai and samurai culture and samurai films, which were a big genre around the time Star Wars was first being made. Yeah. So the next historical connection was actually something that really surprised me when I was doing like research for this little talk. Um, so we mentioned earlier that uh, the Empire, the Galactic Empire in Star Wars, is more or less based off the Nazis. Um, they have stormtroopers. They're very, very not cool with anyone who's different. They're basically a fascist authoritarian, um, entity. And you would think that the uniforms would reflect, that same influence. That they would be, you know, the space Nazis would look like Nazis. Um, and in some cases they do. In other cases, the influence actually goes a bit further back. Um, so the original Imperial officer's uniform is actually not based off Nazi uniforms from World War II. They're based off the uniforms of Prussian Lancers, which were, a light cavalry unit that existed in the Prussian army and even the early Imperial German army, right up just about to the beginning of World War One. And you still see this, design of uniform uh, throughout the duration of World War One. By World War Two, it's gone, but it does serve as the primary inspiration for the Imperial officer's uniform that you see on the screen there. And it's actually kind of interesting because, you know, a lot of, of both Imperial Germany and Nazi Germany's military culture was largely influenced by the Prussian military. The infamous goose step, that silly march that the Nazis always did, with throwing their legs up in the air. That is initially Prussian, or was initially attributed to the Prussian military. Um, so I think it's interesting that the space Nazis are also taking their cues from early Prussia, or late Prussia. But I think it's still an interesting connection. Um, so the next one is probably one that a lot of people are familiar with. Uh, it's probably the simplest one. It's also probably the biggest one in terms of just how many connections can be made. Because Star Wars, the half the title is war. There are a lot of weapons around. And in designing these weapons, the prop masters needed something to start with. So a lot of weapons in the Star Wars universe are based on real world firearms. So space guns. Let's talk about the space guns. So we have a couple examples that I pulled off the internet of the various weapons that are featured in Star Wars and their real world uh, bases, essentially. Um, over to the you know left, you have the famous Jawa blaster, um, which is the Jawas used to you know temporarily decommission R2D2 uh, at the beginning of, or close to the beginning of A New Hope, of the original Star Wars. That is just a sawed-off Lee Enfield with the grenade launcher attachment from the First World War. That's entirely what it is. There's nothing really added on. Later versions that appear in later films and shows kind of dress it up a bit more, but that was what the original version looked like. Then right next to that, we have on top, behind backed by the red, is the standard Rebel blaster rifle, which I can't remember the name. It has some crazy uh, I think it's like A280 blaster rifle or something like that, I think. And that's the rifle that we see in the hands of the Rebel Alliance in the original trilogy. There are two versions that were used in the Star Wars films. One was just a dressed up AR-15, and then this one here is a dressed up sci-fi Sturmgewehr 44. And really, they added some tubes, they added a scope, because in the late 70s, early 80s, all you had to do was add a scope to a gun and it was a sci-fi gun now. And yeah, it's just a Sturmgewehr, really. You can still see the Sturmgewehr in there somewhere if you look close enough. And then next to that, in the hands of that stormtrooper, we have more or less unaltered in any real way. I think they changed the wooden butt stock, but that's really it. Is an MG34. So the space Nazis were using space Nazi guns. Yeah, go figure. And then we often, in roughly the same parts of the Star Wars films where we see, the space Nazis using the space MG43 or MG34, sorry. We also see them toting around space Lewis guns, which I believe in the Star Wars universe are referred to as the T-21 heavy blaster. And both these weapons actually reflect their real world counterparts, um, including and as well as the Rebel blaster rifle. They all kind of reflect their real world counterparts. The blaster rifle that's based off the Sturmgewehr. It's a good all around, all purpose infantry small arm. The two heavy blasters, they're used as a sort of support weapon, meant to support you know guys running around with blaster rifles, which is what their real world counterparts were meant to do. That's exactly what an NG-34 or a Lewis gun were both designed and intended to be used for. And then the last space gun um, that I wanted to talk about, because it's Han Solo's gun. Han Solo's famous I think it's like the DL-44 or something like that, is just a dressed up Mauser C-96. And because Han Solo is a space cowboy, that means the C-96 is a cowboy gun. This is an argument that has popped up many times here on Bowery Mick History, when we were doing those Verdun Let's Plays over on the Tattooed Historians Twitch channel. But yeah, C-96 space cowboy gun. And it's just a standard pistol, really. I mean, it's an interesting gun. And once again, you see, just to make it sci-fi, they add on a few little buttons and knobs and toss on a telescopic sight that never gets used but just looks cool. Now it's no longer one of the first self-loading magazine-fed German sidearms, and it's now Han Solo's quick draw blaster. I think I got one more little thing to show off, and this was just something I thought was neat. Probably the least noticeable historical connection, and that is the Millennium Falcon's cockpit. Millennium Falcon, a spaceship flown by Han Solo and associated company. Well, its cockpit is based off the B-29 Super Fortress, which was an American bomber that saw a decent amount of action in the later part of World War II, mostly in the Pacific theater of World War II. Possibly the two most famous B-29s are the Enola Gay and the Boxcar. And these were the two planes that dropped the first atomic bombs at the end of World War II. So it was a relatively famous model of bomber in the years that followed the Second World War. And so it should really be no surprise that it kind of forms the basis of the design for the Millennium Falcon. This is a purely inconsequential connection. I just thought it was neat, as I wrote right there. So that's all the things I had to show off. So the big point of all this is, we generally a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people tend to see history as existing in its own little vacuum. It's its own little thing. And in reality, history is woven into everything. Everything in our society, everything in our lives. And it can be it's woven into big important things. It can be woven into fun bits of entertainment like Star Wars. So there is, it's not this little thing that you can you can afford to ignore. It's kind of everywhere. And so I hope everyone takes everyone who watches this, comes away thinking, huh, maybe maybe I should look for, the historical influences and connections and, the other bits of media and other things around me. Um, but yeah, so that's all I got. Thank you to everyone who watched. Thank you to everyone who, maybe watched, you know, afterwards, the recordings and whatnot. The last time I did this, got a pretty decent performance. Seems like a lot of people enjoyed it. This is, as I said in that one, this is gonna be a weekly thing. I haven't decided what I'm gonna be doing next week. I have some ideas. Still have to make those decisions though. Um, and so yeah, be sure to tune in next week on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitch, whatever you prefer. Um, and yeah, other than that, I'm also going to be streaming on Twitch tomorrow night, doing some gaming. Figured since I spent tonight talking about Star Wars, I'll play some classic Star Wars games and talk about Star Wars cultural impact, because it does have a significant cultural impact. But yeah, other than that, thank you all for watching and have a great rest of your night.